before I get started, just briefly a couple of announcements. Actually, I'm really glad that I can greet him on behalf of the Institute. We've been working on this idea for a certain time, actually. And first of all, I have to thank our colleague Dušan Dostanić, who actually organized this contact and provided the possibility that we have Mr. Zoltan today with us. So, just briefly, as we announced, he's our colleague from Hungary, working and living in Budapest, and doing his PhD on Peter Pazmani Catholic University, very well-known intellectual and academic institution in Hungary. Also, he is connected with Thomas Molnar Institute, addressed and actually institute following along the lines of the very famous political theorist Thomas Molnar, who is by origin from Hungary. And this is more or less defining his basic interest, which is connected with political philosophy and political theory, classical political theory of the Catholic kind, and especially conservative political history in some way. He is author of the book published in 2016 in Hungarian, Edmund Burke as a criticist, if I'm right for the translation.
The critics of Edmund Burke.
Okay, and now we have the chance to see part of his work, his PhD work, de facto, the political theory of Erika fon Kuehnelt-Leddihn. And this is, I think, probably the first ever lecture or anything done connected with Kuehnelt-Leddihn, who is not so unknown person as it is here with us. You will see this is a very, very interesting person, very well known in certain circles in the United States of America. For example, if you go to the Mises Institute, you will have there at least 4 of his main books translated in English, which you can download down there. And many of them are really very interesting. And as you will see, as we put it briefly, he is very interesting combination of a nobleman, a monarchist, and in some sense libertarian or classical liberal as well. But I will not take any more, and I will just ask Stevan to take it over. And once more, thanks to Zoltan for coming to Serbia, and I hope that we will continue our further cooperation. Please.
Once again, Mr. Zoltan, welcome to Bави, the Institute of European Studies. The rules of engagements are that you will be speaking for up to 15 minutes, not more than an hour if you can. And then we will have time for Q&A.
I'm very happy to be here and thankful to Dušan, especially. First, I would like to apologize all of you because my English is not very well, my spoken English. So I will read it out. Do the best. Okay, so you can see the title here. It's about Kuehnelt-Leddihn, an Austrian political thinker, who was, in my opinion, and as I see, fundamentally a Christian anti-utopianist. You can see the gentleman here and the date of his life. In this lecture, I would like to sum up the principal ideas of one of the 20th century's brightest conservative political theorists, Erika fon Kuehnelt-Leddihn. I will consider how Kuehnelt-Leddihn assessed the grand political doctrines of the 20th century: communism, socialism, national socialism, fascism, and liberal democracy as political philosophies from a special point of view, which is, as I will call it, a position of a Christian philosopher who deal with political modernity as an ultimate and fundamental egalitarian utopianism. Kuehnelt-Leddihn not only analyzed and criticized, but also came into very close physical contact with most of these political regimes, since he lived a very long life. You can see from 1909 to 1999. And according to his own words, virtually visited all the countries of the world. Okay. He was born in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy as a subject of Franz Joseph I. At the age of 16, he was a correspondent of an illustrious British weekly newspaper, The Spectator. He studied law at the University of Wien and at the age of 18. He continued his studies at Budapest, where he done his master's degree of economics and his PhD of theology. After that, he traveled to England, where he taught at Beaumont College, a Jesuit private school. In 1937, he traveled to the United States. He received a professorship in Georgetown University and was appointed to the head of the St. Peter's College, Department of History and Sociology. He taught Japanese at Fordham University. And then, for 5 years, he worked at Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia, where he wrote his masterpiece, Liberty or Equality. After World War II, he returned to Austria and lived in Tyrol, Lanz, until his death. He lived here for the rest of his life, except for frequent trips to many parts of the world. 5 or 6 years after he left the United States, the emerging American neoconservative movement began to discover him. His magnum opus, Liberty or Equality, was published in English in 1952. This directed to him the attention of the young William F. Buckley, who, as a disciple of William Kendall, was close to the right wing of the anti-communist McCarthists. Buckley, a few years later, founded the very influential National Review, which later was a fostering force of Kuehnelt-Leddin's career and impact in the United States. He densely published articles in the review and continued for this for more than 30 years. Kuehnelt-Leddihn wrote for a number of papers, including Chronicles, Modern Age, Thoughts, Rothbard-Rottler Report, and Catholic World. He worked for the Action Institute and was an associate researcher at the Mises Institute. For a certain time, he was a member of the group of Mont Pelerin Society. In addition to the main political philosophical works, which are, you can see it's The Menace of the Herd, Liberty or Equality, The Timeless Christian, Leftism, From Sade and Marx to Hitler and Marxism, and Leftism Revisited, From Sade to Marx to Hitler and Pol Pot, which is an extended edition of the latter. He also wrote 4 novels, The Gates of Hell, an historical novel of the present day, Night Over the East, Black Banners, and Moscow. He has minor books and articles in his mother tongue, German. As an amateur painter and graphic artist, he also produced grotesque, strange illustration for his works. I can show you some. For example, the title is Modern Age with Hitler and Marx. And another one, The Grave Diggers, to Roosevelt, Lenin and Hitler. And his opinion in 20th century maybe. Okay. He spoke 8 languages and read in 16. As a passionate traveler, he visited the USSR and visited almost all the states of the United States. He described his position, his own political position, as extreme conservative arch liberal, or the liberal of the extreme right. The irony of his style is apparent. Besides this, he declared himself as a right-wingist, and a monarchist too. This may sound very strange for today's readers, as many times and in many places he may hear the following. Now, the notions of right-wingism and leftism no longer constitute self-explanatory political lines that everyone can clearly distinguish from each other. Labels no longer cover realistic content. They are actually outdated, just as being a monarchist, of course. Kuehnelt-Leddihn, on the other hand, considered that these terms could be used and there is still a need for the ideological self-definition of the right wing or of the left wing. Thus, he disputed the view of a very, very well-known and influential American conservative theorist, Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk said, "We are not enthusiastic about abstract doctrines, though they are called conservative, liberal, or radical. However, Kuehnelt-Leddihn himself did not create a unified system of thoughts. His thinking is far from being monolithic, and despite his own doctrines, he is still related to those who criticize doctrinal thinking, as I see. All of this can be seen in his political ideological coordinate system. He often positively refers thinkers who are light years away from each other, such as in Kuehnelt-Leddin's own terminology, the right-wing anarchist Proudhon, the classical Republican John Adams, and the anti-democratic liberal Tocqueville, or even Donoso Cortés, the Spanish Catholic statesman who allowed dictatorship. However, behind this heterogeneity, we can find one unifying principle: the 2,000 years of Christian philosophical tradition, mainly in the case of Kuehnelt-Leddihn, this is a neo-Thomism with a hint of Christian existentialism, in his own words, from which the basic principles of Kuehnelt-Leddin's political thought are derived. All the consequences of his thinking is in line with the principles of Christian theology, moral philosophy, and metaphysics. Erika fon Kuehnelt-Leddihn was, first of all, in my opinion, a Catholic political thinker, a highly skeptical one of modernity, and I would like to stress that we should see his relationship to the social principles in this regard. As I see, the very root of Kuehnelt-Leddin's political thinking is in his insistence of theological anthropology. First of all, he stressed the impossibility of developing the human nature through rational institutions. In his point of view, the ground political conceptions of modernity are all mainly utopias. They are abstract constructions, since they have a secular view of man which does not take into account man's fallen nature, according to Christian and Catholic theology. So this is the original sin, its consequences. Or in secular terms, not in the terms of Christian philosophy, man has limitations. All common philosophical starting point in the theory of Kuehnelt-Leddihn is the criticism of the desire for equality. As a matter of fact, we can say that Kuehnelt-Leddin's whole political theory and study is an attempt to solve this problem: the problem of the apparent egalitarian utopianism of modern political thought. The critique of utopianism may be the most permanent and a very common element of the so-called conservative political thought, from Richard Hooker to Edmund Burke and Roger Scruton. Most of these authors were Christians, and according to them, utopia is such a good place which is also a no place, as the original Greek term also includes these two meanings, eutopia or utopia. It is something that cannot be found in reality, and thus the reality of perfect societies where all the problems of mankind are solved is congruent only with the mind of their believers, the utopians. To be sure, this idea is deeply rooted in not just the Christian tradition of European philosophical thought, such as the two cities of Austin, of course, but we may find the very roots also in Plato's second best constitution of the laws or the politics of Aristotle. In this regard, we can say every conservative thinker is an essential anti-utopianist because, according to them, there is a fundamental ontological limitation of human existence, Man has a fallen or sinful nature, and as a consequence, one cannot construct something essentially better than one's own nature. According to such critiques, human nature cannot be liberated or improved through the course of history, and contrary to the most famous doctrine of Rousseau, it was not the evil institutions that corrupted man, but the institutions of man could never have been perfect, since man's nature is already corrupted from the beginning. Instead of pursuing the dream of a perfect society, conservatives has always recommended the acceptance of the second best constitution, as Plato put it after the adventures with Dionysius of Syracuse. These constitutions may have unjust relations, imperfections and disabilities, but it may also be harmonized with human nature. On the other hand, Kuehnelt-Leddihn emphasized that conservatives, especially in America, tend to criticize everything that has related to political ideologies and theory as such, as utopianism or leftism. But he continues, they should not actually reject all ideologies, only learn to differentiate between positive and negative ideologies. And he also stresses that the same is true in the case of utopias, and in this special sense, despite all of the above, we still need a utopia of some kind. He writes, without a utopia which is directed at something better, there will be no challenge, but we must distinguish between realistic and unrealistic utopias. A good government concept could have a positive utopia, but to envision a society in which everyone is equal is nothing more than a nightmare. Of course, he says, if every theory is wrong, just because they are theories, any such political theory should be seen as a utopia, which provides for some kind of deontological criteria for the nature of government. The utopian element arises in every political philosophy, which is not only a description of an existing state, but also a formulation of moral, ethical, and metaphysical criteria. And the description of St. Thomas De Regimine Principium should be seen as utopian just as much as the theory of state by Thomas More, Plato, or Thomas Hobbes. It is clear, however, that this kind of theories cannot be aligned with modernity's unrealistic and absurd state theories, according to our author, which could be seen as utopias or good places only in the eyes of the adherents, but they are practically dystopias, according to Kuehnelt-Leddihn. So we have to differentiate between positive and negative utopias, and perhaps just call the latter the real utopianism. Those authors trends whom Kuehnelt-Leddihn often criticizes in his works, be them the philosophers of the French Enlightenment, the German Romantics, or the British Fabian socialists, regarded themselves mostly as progressives. Nearly all of them assumed that the historical process had a mysterious revolutionary target, and that will eventually lead to the end of history, to a world status in which there is no longer what to say, and all of humanity's aims and desires ever raised are satisfied. This would be their utopia, that is really the non-existent place, which is not yet real, but which we could be created and achieved. In Kuehnelt-Leddin's interpretation, the desire of utopian thinking is a result of a tendency of the human mind, which manifests itself in almost every age and era of history, but only hegemonic in modernity, which is the desire for equality. It seems to him that the most popular political ideas in modernity generally aim to eliminate injustice or to create a perfect society, which seem to be utopian goals. Contrary to pre-modern political utopias such as Plato's Republic, in no way do they aim to achieve an ideal inequality, for instance. The principle of inequality does not sound too good to the moderns, and the official practical policies and the government objectives are mostly aimed to tackling inequalities. Could all the grand political narratives of modernity only be different phases of the same utopian scenario, the creating of perfect equality? He asks. Okay, a short exposition on his theory of equality and liberty may illuminate this problem. He suggests two tendencies are present in human nature, which can be seen in political theory as well. One is the desire of merging with others. He called it identitarianism. And the other is the opposite desire, to be different, diversitarianism. These are basic facts and tendencies of human existence, both necessary for life. According to his theory, we can say that in the course of modern history, the tendency of identitarianism is more and more present, while the tendency of diversitarianism is fading. We can observe this in many grounds. In modernity, Kuehnelt-Leddihn argues the lack of freedom is manifested evidently. The earlier hierarchies are eradicated by the royal absolutisms and then by successive democratic revolutions. As a result, the emerging vacuum was replaced by a Weberian bureaucratic authority. Modern state bureaucracy overwhelmed all public bodies, ordinances, provinces and other liberties. On the one hand, this was done in the name of equality, proclaimed on the basis of popular parliamentary sovereignty, and on the other hand, by anti-hierarchy leveling totalitarianism, although these two tendencies are by no means independent from each other. As a fruit of these processes in the modern world, while spending real eulogies on it and raising it to a rank of an official ideology, there is actually less freedom than in any previous era. According to our author, the identitarianism of modernity is not only manifested by the increasing loss of religion, that means the loss of transcendence as the completely different, but, and not entirely independent of it, it also appears in the enhanced over-affirmation of the use of technology. The worship of technology in the modern world also has an egalitarian flavor, and this is linked to the further loss of liberty. This trend is noticeable in the desire to unify the world through technological processes, which points to a greater identity and conformity. Modern city, writes Kuehnelt-Leddihn in The Menace of the Herd, one of his most influential early work, has an overcomplicated structure of technology requiring an infinite number of laws, regulations, restrictions, controls, which are often deeply intervened in the private sphere of the individual. According to him, these are necessary constraints that we have paid for the illusion of progress. Virtually everything has to be registered, licensed, and so on, so the price of liberation by technological advancement has to be paid by restrictions in other spheres of life. A modern employee possesses the more technical devices, the more dependent he is, as becoming subservient to these means. According to Kuehnelt-Leddihn, this modern tendency for equalization is deeply rooted in a misinterpretation of a Christian tenet: the equality of all souls before God. Because if everyone was equal before God, literally, it would not make sense to talk about the creation of individual souls. Ultimate equality is a spiritual possibility that can be achieved through a conscious effort, hence not an actual reality. According to Kuehnelt-Leddihn, this misinterpretation was also present in various heretical groups of medieval times, such as in the Reformation, which secularized the cloister and made monasticism obligatory by the abolition of it. By this, he means to be understood that the strict rules of a Catholic cloister were transfigured into the asceticism of Protestant discipline and work ethics. The hard-working man became the ideal, and it also invoked the notion of unnecessary classes, such as the clergy, for example, because they did not accumulate material wealth. which was increasingly seen by the Protestants as God's reward. In this process, we can clearly observe a tendency of equalization. If everyone is doing fundamentally the same, there will be earthly happiness, while secular satisfaction is the sign of the greater grace of God. Protestantism was followed by deism and the increasingly secular worldview of the era of the French Enlightenment. The French Revolution was itself an attempt to create a utopia based on the design of total equality. The results are clearly seen in the dictatorship of Robespierre, which went so far, says Kuehnelt-Leddihn, that only Robespierre's fall prevented the destruction of all the steeples and towers. In the subsequent centuries, we can see that various forms of utopian egalitarianism occur. There were two main tendencies, the totalitarian and the democratic form. But at the same time, all democracy, said Kuehnelt-Leddihn, is inherently totalitarian. And all totalitarianism is democratic by nature. Doubtless, this is a provocative statement, very provocative, which should be treated with caution, and further investigation should be provided. It is perhaps in Marxism that the nature of the par excellence utopia and its characteristic features are the most striking, according to him. It seems that, in his interpretation, Karl Marx and Marxist authors relied mostly on baseless notions, although they made all effort to detach their system from the previous utopian socialists as scientific ones. But Marx loses his scientific credentials, where his analysis states that all religion, law, and state will become superfluous in the coming world of earthly happiness. So this is completely a utopian notion. Kuehnelt-Leddihn basically handles communism as a very unlucky combination of an utopian envy, stupidity, and evil, in his own words. The foremost goal of communism is directed to change human nature, with no regard for facts and possibilities. The communist utopianists believe in the boundless plasticity of human existence. The mind is empty and the state's just luck. And the state's duty is to writing on this sheet. Of course, this is only possible if we are taking a strong anti-Platonic stance, denying all kind of innatism, for example. And together with Feuerbach, we say, der Mensch ist, was ist. Man is what he is. The progressive utopias, such as communism, of course, did not create equality or living without the state. As a matter of fact, the independence of the state, which was always one of the declared purposes of the communists, is totally abolished in existing communist regimes. According to Kuehnelt-Leddihn, the motivation of communism was envy, and the root idea of the communist ideology sounds like, I am poor because she is or he is rich. This is already a contradiction, because it's Kuehnelt-Leddihn words, you can see. Yet, Isabel's beauty is not the result of Eloy's plainness, nor Bob's brightness of Tim's stupidity. Again, envy might subconsciously use a statistical argument. Not all of our, say us, but our brothers can be bright, not all of our sisters pretty. Fate handed it to her, to him, and discriminated against me. As he writes, in the last 2000 years, the exploitation of envy, its mobilization among the masses, coupled with the denigration of individuals, but more frequently of classes, races, nations, or religious communities, has been the very key to political success. The history of the Western world since the end of the 18th century cannot be written without this fact constantly in mind. We can see one of the most striking examples of this in communism. There is no groups in communism which could have a right to be different, because in theory there is no individual who is not equal with others. One may ask how all this criticism relates to the so-called right-wing regimes whose views were theoretically opposed to the Marxist utopia. From the foregoing, it seems Kuehnelt-Leddihn recognized this antagonism as a battle between different concepts of egalitarian utopianism. In the case of German National Socialism, such elements are immediately conspicuous as the new Thousand-Year Reich, which Kuehnelt-Leddihn considers to have been inspired by the essentially millenarian chiastic sources of the Middle Ages, or early modern age. The Nazi Reich aimed to establishing a new ideologically and racially pure realm, from which all elements deemed alien were removed. He considers National Socialism essentially a racial utopia, and finds that in the case of Hitlerism, the most obviously utopian element is to be found in the doctrine of the race. In Italian fascism, the same is perceived in the quasi-mystical worship of the state. One of the most typical examples of this is Mussolini's famous definition: all within the state, nothing outside of the state, nothing against the state. German National Socialism, whose real roots Kuehnelt-Leddihn identifies in a strange way, I think, in Czech Husitism and the Czech National Socialist Party, is nothing but a synthesis of all modernism. As he writes, what New Germany's leaders are doing is nothing less than copying Emile Comte, Jeremy Bentham, John Dewey and Robespierre. They do nothing but believe in the teaching of utilitarianism, environmentalism, biology and survival of the fittest, and the complete catechism of unlimited modernism. The National Socialist Führer principle is on the other aspect of collectivism, and even a superficial observer can discover the trace of medieval patriarchy in that. The German, as well as the British conservatives, committed the greatest mistake, maybe, in seeing nationalism as a right-wing movement. Their second mistake was accepting militarism as a conservative phenomenon, forgetting that the great aristocrat and conservative, Pope Leo XIII, had attacked it most fiercely. The most grotesque decision was made when the National Socialists were seated at the far right of the Reichstag. According to Kuehnelt-Leddihn, their place was supposed to be somewhere between the Communists and the Social Democrats. As he writes, Hitler's program was almost entirely left-wing and socialist. Hitler, when he came to domination, saw himself as the embodiment of the German masses and wanted to see Germany in full uniformity with the elimination of local features, the forced unification of the churches, including deportation of those who are different from the norm. Hitler regarded his movement not just the executor of Marxism, but as in Hitler's own words, as a performer of the essence and the true part of Marxism by removing the Talmudic Jewish dogma. In that sense, Hitler considered the new Germany as a true democracy. The most hated groups, besides the Jews, were kings and aristocrats, so it is perhaps no coincidence that the resistance movement was established firstly in the armed force in fourth form. Undoubtedly, this may be the point, the liberal democracy and its criticism, where his analysis shocks even his conservative readers. Since liberal democracy is usually depicted in the mainstream of political thinking as the only possible answer to the totalitarian oppression. But in Kuehnelt-Leddin's interpretation, not only brutal collectivist and revolutionary socializing plans like communism or national socialism can be considered egalitarian utopias. Utopianism is not necessarily and not always spectacular. The utopian principle may be presented in various ways, both totalitarian and democratic, as the ideologies of the American left proved under Wilson's legislation. Kuehnelt-Leddihn criticized the attitude of leftist intellectuals, such as the liberals in the Democratic Party of the United States, as a think tank that allowed the Wilson and the Roosevelt administrations to come up with the slogans such as a crusade for democracy or to make the world safe for democracy, while increasingly setting soft totalitarianism in motion, as Tocqueville had predicted in a chapter in The American Democracy, when he wrote about the guardian state and the good-natured tyranny. He criticized American leftist thinking because of the naive and utopian assumptions of human nature that could not have meant a real alternative to Soviet communism. There is no doubt, he says, that in the past, before democracy had been identified with ideas such as advanced society and freedom, democracies were embraced mainly those progressive radicals who believed in inevitable historical progress and in the possibility of some kind of ideal equality in the future. Kuehnelt-Leddihn emphasized that radical democratic progressionism is typically a materialistic concept of justice, which, however distinct from Marxist utopianism, is much closer to it in terms of its preferred values. One of the most important premises of the evolutionary principle, whether Marxist or not, had already appeared in early British liberalism. Any external constraint that does not favor the purely economic principle is something harmful, they consider, and something harmful in itself. But the future is undoubtedly a happier prospect than the past. Society is automatically evolving, and the prospects for a happy future will lead to the minimalization, possibly to the elimination of state power. Kuehnelt-Leddihn takes democracy in its literal meaning. This means the kratos, power, of the demos, which means primarily that the origin of power is from the people and the people can govern themselves through this power. This concept assumes that all the actors of the political community are equal. There are no qualitative differences between them, and because of that, the decision of the majority is the sole criterion of political decision making. According to him, the problem with that mechanism is the same as with modern political ideologies in general. This method is blind to the real qualitative difference in the world and between the people, such as intelligence, discretion, knowledge and competence. And because of this blindness, it sacrifices quality on the altar of quantity. This mechanism is, so Kuehnelt-Leddihn, inherently totalitarian. Because in a full democracy, there is no limitation on the power of the majority in abstract. The majority is the absolute sovereign, and it can do everything in theory because it is the source of all law. A theory of modern democracy is a fundamental egalitarian utopianism, as it is based on the assumption that the majority is wise. Nevertheless, he says, an experience suggests that the majority is not very wise, but easily manipulated. It could be seen, for example, in the case of National Socialism, which is, in Kuehnelt-Leddihn views, clearly a populistic plebeian ideology, and it has democratic roots. According to Kuehnelt-Leddihn, the democracy, not as a political system, but as a hope for the future, a principle expresses something that is related to the profound relativism of the modern man. The principle of majority rule, which assumes that the majority is right and that truth is a purely quantitative question, can be disclosed as a nearly superstitious respect for the omnipotence of the numbers. In philosophy, this appears to be a mechanistic, materialistic concept of reality, and clearly not a Christian or a theist or an Aristotelian. The principle of democracy, when it first appeared, contained something incompatible with the traditional, the Platonic or the Christian concept of the world order. That was clearly seen, for example, the concept of the medieval concept of the universe and society. It was the idea that art, love, joy described as the great chain of being. It's one of the favorite issue of conservative thinkers, every one of them. The idea of hierarchy, which of course is not merely a material, economic, social or political hierarchy, but primarily it is a spiritual one. It means that since the world is divine, the ruler of the universe is not man but God. Creation is manifested through hierarchical degrees. The world is not born out of chaos, but it is a manifestation of spiritual principles. The lower level always follows the higher one and not the other way around. The human world, if it is to function properly, must reflect the divine world. That is to say, there is a need for a hierarchic domination, as the manifestation of the universe comes from an order of domination, from the order of God. For those who perceive the similar idea of the nature of the universe, the legitimacy of the physical universe has shown that, unlike the founding of evolutionism, for example, the things left to themselves, not inspired by some force from above, do not evolve spontaneously, but they tend to disintegrate, break apart. Moving from the spiritual to the material means, for example, in the case of liberalism, or may I say classical liberalism as well, precisely the increase in determination and necessity. And this is the decrease of freedom, not the increase. The principle of democracy presupposed that domination was not from above, but from below. And this is the main point of criticism, I think, in Kuehnelt-Leddihn theory. That is, the origin of domination is not from the spiritual, but from the material side or principle. Thus, it is possible to understand how Kuehnelt-Leddihn connected the age of democracy with the age of materialism, and also why it was not possible for him to reconcile the democratic principle with the Christian religion, and why he meant these two were explicitly opposed to each other. So he was by definition not a Christian democrat. Okay. America. It's a hot topic for Kuehnelt-Leddihn. So the review of the analysis of the utopianist nature of modern political thinking, if we take it, we would like to address the question: how Kuehnelt-Leddihn assessed the United States of America? How did he relate to a country in which he spent a significant part of his life? From now on, it is clear that the United States has a number of features that can be typically described in his concepts of egalitarian utopianism. And it is almost a matter of fact that conservatism is one of the last things that one associates with America. There are some indications that suggest that Kuehnelt-Leddihn was very much in agreement with this statement, especially when he wrote about the mainstream of American political thinking. He criticized heavily the foreign policy of American left, which in his view gave the mandate to destroy the Austro-Hungarian monarchy on the pretext of securing the world for democracy, thus creating a fatal instability in the Central European region, which enabled the formation of totalitarian regimes. In the case of the Wilson administration, the idea of democracy became an ideology in the form of democratization. The left in the United States, as well as in the UK, labeled all that was not modern, advanced, and democratic as retrograde, reactionary, things that had to disappear from the face of the earth. American intervention openly tended, in the First World War, to destruction of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and created an enormous power vacuum, favoring the later National Socialist Germany. This was in the name of Wilson's ideological democratic jihad. The ideological warfare prevented all opportunities for peace and totalized war. The reaction had to be lost. No agreement could be reached. Since Wilson's government had abandoned isolationism, it explicitly prevented the compromise that Emperor Charles presented to the Entente, which could have ensured the survival of the traditional monarchies. However, Wilson's program proved to be a tragic utopia. According to Kuehnelt-Leddihn, the anti-monarchy credo ignored organic processes and indirectly led to Hitler's coup. The monarchy, however, was actually to be murdered because its idea inevitably linked to illegitimate distinction between human and human. As he writes, the more a foreign state resembled the USA, the more it was considered progressive and friendly. This was determined by a special and inherently grotesque statistical measurements. Government, freedom of the press, class differences, female emancipation, literacy, and the number of telephones, the status of religious minorities, the precision of railway schedules, and the cleanliness of hotels were all important value makers. By making anti-monarchism the supreme weapon of the US, Allied propaganda successfully set up the Axis armies as murderers and sadists. As he writes, the monumental ignorance of the American left, the complete misunderstanding and neglect of human nature, the lack of knowledge of the basic facts of history, of geography, economy, strategy and politics brought about catastrophic effects. Of course, Kuehnelt-Leddihn also appreciated America in another side, but not because it was a democratic and a progressive nation, but on the contrary, because of the fact that in America they actually kept the flame of freedom and more or less the practice of regimen mixtum. According to him, the American founding fathers, as John Adams and Alexander Hamilton in particular, were not democrats, but old-fashioned, may I say old Whig aristocrats, like Edmund Burke, who relied on the centralizing aspiration of the modern state in a classic Ciceronian Republican tradition, the English people and the nobility of the country, and their efforts aimed to create an aristocratic republic rather than a plebeian populist democracy. Similar to Hannah Arendt in this regard, Kuehnelt-Leddihn saw the American founding fathers skeptical of progressive democracy, as they generally considered it a mob rule, in Greek terms ochlocracy, dangerous to freedom. According to him, these reservations are clear among the Federalists, especially at Adams, Madison and Hamilton, but they also are available to Thomas Jefferson as well, a so-called progressive Democrat who was, according to Kuehnelt-Leddihn, actually an idealistic agrarian Republican. Okay, let's so the conclusions. Kuehnelt-Leddin's criticism of political modernity as egalitarian utopianism may not sound completely convincing to everyone. However, if conservatism is taken seriously as a political idea that can be distinct from liberalism and or socialism or from fascism, it is evident that it cannot be the preservation of the status quo, especially not in the present times when the state, history and society is based on structures deriving from revolutions, which are mostly directed against all that can be linked to a Christian and a traditional view of existence, which is, according to our author, seems to be the only non-utopian way of thinking about human nature, the state, and society. But what is actually traditional and what is modern? There are more and more questions arising. Where is the true origin of modernity? And where are the theological roots so important for a Christian and a Catholic thinker? Regarding the problem of modernity is materialism, which he criticized, very hard criticized. As I see, the fundamental task is to investigate the relation between the revelation and the Kantian autonomous reason. In other words, faith-based religion and modern philosophy. Philosophy was, before the Enlightenment, first of all, an ancilla theologiae, the handmaiden of theology. But with the unfolding of modernity, an ever more quickly widening gap has occurred between philosophy and religion, with a perspective of no transcendence, which manifested itself in the autonomy of reason and enlightenment. But now, the 3 centuries after the beginning of the Enlightenment, philosophy is still not autonomous, but has become ancilla scientiae, the handmaiden of natural science. And the price of this process is the removal of the fundamental principles of being irreducible to pure quantity, equivalent with the fundamental questions of philosophy, from the horizon and the philosophy of politics as well. But there are a troubling question arises here. Would it be possible to reconstruct this bridge between reason and faith, which has been broken for a long time? The most influential figures of modern philosophy, for example Kant, Nietzsche, Heidegger or Sartre, would say no, I think. And there is another question troubling for non-modernist Christian thinkers like Kuehnelt-Leddihn. This is more troubling. Does Christianity per se contribute to a creation of the image of the modern world? Can modernity as such be considered a special Christian heresy, as an Orthodox Christian thinker, Russian one, Nikolai Berdyaev said? Does Christianity, with the Entzauberung of the pre-Christian world, with the conception of linear time, as Mircea Eliade says, for example, not already include the principle of secularism? I think this is the most important and maybe the most troubling question, which was unfolded in a dialectic historical process. As Kuehnelt-Leddihn puts it, the relationship between modernity and Christianity is paradoxical. If we wish to understand the modern Western civilization, we can do so only through and with Christianity. However, if we really want to know what Europe actually means, we have to take a look from the outside, from a point of view of a non-Christian civilization. For example, Buddhism. There is no doubt that the modern nationalism, which is scholasticism grandson, has not evolved in other parts of the world, and therefore modernity is unthinkable without Christian and Greek, of course, philosophical thought. His critique of political equality may still sound simplistic to some. It is indubitable that are fundamental differences between the mentality and the cultural embeddedness of fascism and Bolshevism, or national socialism and the American-style capitalism or democracy. We cannot handle Nietzsche and Marx the same way, although both of them were atheists, of course, and fighting against Christianity and the old world order of some kind. The origins of these political movements are more diverse, such as if you see the real religiosity in such movements, such as, for example, the Romanian Iron Guard, or maybe some National Socialist leaders' interest in the occult philosophy. for Himmler, for example. These were very characteristic elements in these movements that have no relations to the problem of equality. Regarding, for example, communism, in contrast with such thinkers, such as Raymond Aron, for example, Kuehnelt-Leddihn was less interested in the examination of the existing communist regimes. Raymond Aron claims that there is an impenetrable dividing line between totalitarian and non-totalitarian systems. And this is more important that these are essentially democracies, have democratic roots or not. So this is not the main question if you handle with communism or every kind of totalitarianism. The main question and the fundamental difference lies between that is there a rule of law or is there terror regimes? So and is there a constitutional framework of the state or they mold this constitutional framework? And there is a bureaucratic system just in the Soviet Union, and no balance and no just totalitarianism, the killing machine. It also seems to be true, as Aron says, that in modern Western democracies there are limitations of the power on the majority. This is the constitution of the state. So we cannot say in a simple way, as the way Kuehnelt-Leddihn stressed, that there is a tyranny of majority. But it is also true that at the same time, that this limitation, as Kuehnelt-Leddihn argues, is not a democratic element by nature. But these are clearly elitist conceptions. Constitutions can theoretically be altered by the force of majority. And this is, I think, troubling for Aron, for example. Because of this, in democracies there is no real protection against the rising of utopian tyrannies, as Plato said, for example. No matter whether this is the tyranny of majority or a single individual, there is danger. As he said, the multitude is not wise. They would free Barabbas instead of Jesus. And it also seems to be true that once neutral term of democracy has now become democratism, which can be used as a political weapon against everyone and everything. Thank you very much.
Mr. Zoltan, thank you very much for pointing us so detailed and deeply into the political thought of Mr. Leddihn. And now I would open the floor for eventual questions of the audience. Please. Just introduce yourselves.
Pete Institute of European Studies. I wrote that this author claimed that America, after the Great War, misunderstood the importance of Austria-Hungarian Empire existence, and that the destruction of this empire was one of the contributing factors to the rise of Nazism in Germany and Europe. I wrote this in John Waltzer's book called The Last Night of the Habsburg Empire. So, is it correct, and what's your opinion about this?
So what's my opinion on Kuehnelt-Leddihn's view?
Yes, yes.
Maybe
is it correct?
I think that is correct, but okay. So if the monarchy, the old monarchy, was remain in Europe, in Central Europe, there would be no power vacuum. this is clear. And no Nazism in this way as in history we see. But I think the Axis powers were also have a kind of faults that because they lost the war. So it's not just the propaganda or just the evil American left. So in this regard, maybe yes, I think this is a correct analysis in regard with Nazism, but not entirely correct. So it's very one-sided, and just one aspect illuminate just one aspect, and that consider that what faults can also lead that disintegration of the empire. So many political faults. It was a very complex phenomenon.
Yes, he was against the international system which was created after Great War, Woodrow Wilson system of national states. So maybe he will do that, which is true that.
But that he was against Wilsonism, or this they call it Wilsonism. Is that correct or not? Or that's
no, just is it true that?
Yeah, this is true.
In that period, he was against establishing of national states.
Yes, he was basically he was for the Habsburg Empire, and maybe he would stress that nation states can exist inside the empire.
Hi, my name is Milan Yukinovic. I'm a researcher here at the Institute. Some years back I actually read Liberty or Equality. Briefly and superficially, I didn't make much of it. My impression was, and the impression lasted so far, that I kind of suffered from the imperial hangover, so to speak. So that everything he wrote in that book, at least, was deployed in order to explain most to himself and then to the audience what had actually happened. And I did look at it from a bit of a leftist view. He was a privileged class, he was a nobleman with an access to education, to social services, to higher hierarchies of state rule and economic power. So his world, not necessarily imperial order, but his class rule had more or less ended in 1918. So a left critique of his positions, I think is let's say right, so to speak, or has some merit at least. So what is your view on that? Because it seemed to me that he deployed this complex ideology to explain what had happened from a fairly particular position of a nobleman from Austro-Hungary that had lost an empire, lost an imperial order, lost economic basis of his social existence. So do you kind of see that he has a particular position and not really a universalist one?
Thank you for the question. It's important.
Okay.
So maybe a grain of truth in that, I think. But okay, he was a count. He was a high nobility, a member of the high nobility. But he also criticized the nobility. So and these analyses are based on not. I think it's based on more on philosophy, and not so. You can say Plato wrote his work about the state because he was adherent of the kings of Athens. But it's the same questions. Maybe there is some truth.
I mean, he has a right to his motive. That's not it's legitimate. So, but I'm saying, Do you think he's a kind of too involved with his motives? That was
Too involved.
Yeah, that was my impression while reading that. He couldn't decentralize himself from his own role or the role of his, let's say, ruling class. Let's say.
So I see as well that he's not a very objective commentator. So he has subjective subjectivity, and sometimes he stressed that. Okay.
Jovica Pavlović, Institute of European Studies. I also sensed, first a comment, I also sensed a bit of resentment in his work regarding the fall of Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which perhaps made him change his identity a bit, as our colleague said. But to my, this is of course just a superficial impression from one lecture that I heard, but I think that the critique of his work from this position stands. And my question is, how would he view the European Union as a new form of a postmodern empire, if I may say, because it's a semi-democratic, large institution, which does take a form of a postmodern empire, if one might say. And how would he view the role of nation states which are giving up a part of their sovereignty to be in this Pax Europa? So what would his view be on this? And did he have a view, since he did live long enough to see
Yeah. He was in a very good terms with some Christian member of the founding fathers, may I say. But he saw in European Union foreign nations that it not includes Christianity. Maybe this is against. So this is completely secular, completely referred to the French Revolution very much, which was one of, in Kuehnelt-Leddin's worldview, one of the main catastrophes of human history. So the structure, maybe just if we see purely the structure, maybe he would say that some truth in that. So the quasi-monarchical or this quasi-empire or imperial system, this is much more. So this is he is for the monarchical and the imperial system, and not for the purely a nation state or this system.
Yes, so Valerečić from Institute of European Studies. A little bit clarification about Austro-Hungarian monarchy and national socialism, because national socialism appears in Germany, not in the territory of Hungary or Austria.
From Austria.
Yes, but he was from Austria. National socialism appears because of economic crisis in Germany, and even if Austria-Hungarian Empire still lives, I mean, the economic crisis will hit the German part of Europe.
Yeah.
Maybe, sorry, just maybe the fact also for the hypothesis actually that Italy preserved monarchy, but nonetheless became fascist country. It's also very interesting. It's just
Yeah.
Very right.
I think these two questions are very troubling for Kuehnelt-Leddihn because they have no answers to that.
So could you add, I mean, following this question, because before the conversation diverts, I read somewhere that he was actually arguing that if the unification of, if Anschluss happened at the moment of the breaking of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then that would prevent National Socialism from becoming the dominant ideology in Germany. Could you say something about that?
So if the Anschluss would not happen, then I think
was that if Germany and Austria united before World War II, before Hitler coming to power, that actually that would prevent such an ideology of appearing in the first place. That's the hypothesis.
Idea of the, let me say, German Empire with Austria and Germany inside
that would prevent the war. That would prevent World War II.
Or Hitler's coming to power or something.
I don't know exactly, but
thank you very much. Really, I really enjoyed that because I think also all of our colleagues, because Kuehnelt-Leddihn, apart from the fact that it was really one of the, how Buckley said, or who said now, one of the most fascinating persons in the 20th century. I mean, somebody who was reading at 16 languages and so on. And generally, who really lived through the whole 20th century, see, almost he died just the year before millennium change. Actually, it's really fascinating, and we saw from your very good presentation of his basic idea, really something which is unusual mixture of very different traditions and so on and so on. I think so many of those things are very inspiring, controversial, exactly like his thinking, you know. So, by the way, I wanted to say that this is our contribution to the celebration of 200 years of Mark's birthday, which was this year. So, actually, I think that we will continue along these lines. I'm joking with. And I have a couple of comments and ideas, because this really struck me with so many theoretical issues. And apart from the fact that actually he is situationist, conservative in the sense that he is reacting and writing, of course, like all of us, from the perspective of his birth, his development, his class position and so on. I don't think that it automatically avoids theoretical significance of because I think many of those things are really very useful for today. Just let me comment on some and ask on some. First, this idea of democracy, actually, which is very much like Schmittian, and they really insisted, actually, apart from today's perception that liberal democracy is the only kind of democracy, they really insisted on classical understanding of democracy, which really has to be like creating of the unique power, avoiding differences, cleaning off and so on. And I think that in many ways this idea is also returning today, even in contemporary authoritarianism and so on. But beside that, the other issue, and I would like to hear your comment as well, that actually this is his insistence that even liberal democracy could be or is totalitarian by definition is also very useful today. Because I think that actually when idea of liberal, how should I say, preservation of some of the liberties or rights against the tyranny of majority was introduced, that was meant exactly to protect the nobles and the higher class and the tradition of, I don't know, nobility like in Britain and so on. Today it's totally different, you know. It's just to prevent, how should I say, lower or something which used to be called freak acceptance of differences and so on. So it's not to prevent, how should I say, liberalism today is not encouraging or preventing the best in the society, but people who are, let me say, different in different kinds. So in that sense, I think that even with very more and more totalitarian approach, that take a look about, for example, LGBT issue. Whoever comes today and say, for example, as a Christian, what he thinks about that, he will be in Serbia sentenced today, moved out of the public life and so on and so on. So I think in that sense that even he, when he wrote that 50 years ago, was seeing very well potential within liberal democracy for becoming more soft totalitarian like and family legislation and so on. I would like to hear you upon those issues. And the other thing also that strikes me about this situationist position. Well, I also, speaking about Hayek and Mises and so on, it's very interesting that libertarianism, basically as an ideology, of which he is in some sense, let me say, part, insisted at that time on market and free market as a way maybe of preserving the space of Austro-Hungarians. Probably the only ideology that would help preserving in some way, besides monarchy, avoiding of nationalism and so on. There are some of the theories claiming actually that this was the reason why libertarianism at that time was very popular. So that would be really interesting. And at the end, I will not touch it anymore. I will simply use your position here to compare what is Catholicism or Roman Catholicism today, for example, with the way he saw that. Because I think that Catholicism has evolved quite radically toward what is mainstream of the left liberalism today in many different ways. And since you are studying at the Catholic University, that would be really interesting to just a bit spread your basic framework. Sorry again for simply we want to abuse you. Absolutely.
So, the first question was about totalitarian tendencies in liberal democracies, and maybe he saw these tendencies and wrote about them. And if he lived today, he would the same. So just these increasing tendencies, and then if we don't stop this kind of mentality, this will be kind of soft totalitarianism, just as Tocqueville said before in American democracy, and very much like this is the direction. And if we want to prevent it, we change our mind completely, and we should take new or old and new principles, which was derived from a completely different worldview, which are a Christian one or a theological one, not a materialistic one. So this materialism problem behind is all the issues of liberalism. He was a kind of liberal thinker, so he called himself a liberal, a classical one. But maybe, okay, so the classical liberal thinkers was not like that, him, I think. So it's a little bit, not completely true, that he was a liberal. So he called himself a liberal, but okay, so if you take, for example, Tocqueville, so he resembled, but Tocqueville is a true liberal, or he is a conservative, so it's not very clear. Okay. The second was...
I was talking about this, the fact that actually this classical liberalism or libertarianism de facto, of which the whole tendency from, I don't know, Ben Bauer to Mises Hayek was, I think, working as I searched for ideology that would unite also Hungary and to prevent nationalism. That was the idea. So I saw that he was going along this line that you have monarchy and classical liberalism and try to avoid.
So in his earlier years, he was strongly against capitalism. I didn't mention it in my presentation, but he was against, and he was in line with some German thinkers, as we refer them as conservative revolutionists. For example, he was a friend of Ernst Jünger, who was a friend of Ernst Niekisch, who was a national Bolshevist in his terms. But I think so he was not really a Bolshevist, of course. No. But, okay, so Kuehnelt-Leddihn moved in these groups and lines, and he was fiercely against capitalism. So capitalism is one form of modern egalitarian materialism, which is about material wealth and not of freedom. Then he changed his mind.
Which time?
When he traveled to the United States and examined this, how this works, and he had friends there, such as Hayek and Mises. They were new friends. And then he was for capitalism, not against. And maybe he said some similar to your comments, that maybe that classical liberalism can be united with monarchism, and it's not about materialism as well. So he changed his mind on this question, and yes, I think this would be his analysis that you said about.
And at the end, I ask you about the contemporary Catholicism and changes from this time. What he saw.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly what was his opinion on the Second Vatican. So maybe he was, I think, against it. But he has one book on Christianity, and he, in this book, this timeless Christian, he stresses that Christianity is not an evolving phenomenon. So he was more conservative in the religious position. Maybe he criticized these changes. So they saw that Catholic thinking is try to be in line with some moderns, not Catholic or Christian doctrines or principles. It's maybe he was strongly against it, and if he lived today, I think he would be very critical about these phenomenon.
Thank you very much.
Mark Beck, Institute for Political Studies. First of all, I would like to thank you for this clarifying lecture and profound critique of modern democracy, the thing which virtually non-exist in our academic circles until now. And I have two questions. I plan to ask you three questions, but since Mr. Djukovic asked you about his stance regarding the Second Vatican Council, I have always one option to ask you two questions, not three, as I planned earlier. My first question, are you acquainted with some of these ideas or works which are dedicated to the concrete steps which are necessary to be adopted in order to restore the old order of things, conservative order of things? And second question, you mentioned his stance, his thoughts about founding fathers in America. And as far as I understood, you said that he was a little bit critical toward Jefferson, and that he was enchanted or inspired more with Hamilton, as far as I understood.
Yeah.
Could you clarify a little bit that point, because as far as I know, Hamilton was really progressive in his ideas regarding the centralism, national banking, the industrialization, and you mentioned also that Jefferson was an agrarian figure, as a very democratic figure, let's say. But do you think that that agrarian ethos or stance of Jefferson was a little bit something per default that is more conservative than industrial and orientation?
Okay, thanks. So let I start with the second.
That's it.
Okay, then we consider the first one. Maybe yes. It's just like the thing that okay, the materialists or Marxists said that, or they like to say this. Heraclitus was a materialist, and he was our ancestor, and this is the same phenomenon I think in Kuehnelt-Leddin's thoughts, that some grain of truth in that there was a conservative or some kind of feature that he liked in for example Jefferson, and he exaggerated this. And so Hamilton. Okay, so Hamilton was not very enthusiastic about the idea of democracy. He was practically a monarchist. This is true, but he was okay. He didn't say I'm a monarchist, but he was not very progressive Democrat, or he
was a Republican.
He was a Republican, but
president is a monarch.
President is practically a monarch, and he liked to be monarch-like presidents, such as John Adams. But in another side,
quite different.
Yeah. So Hamilton was really mercantilist and kind of not this not coherent person, or his thinking is not coherent. Kuehnelt-Leddihn exaggerates this one-sided again. Both. Yeah. This is apparent. Yeah. Okay.
The first one.
The first one.
Concrete steps toward restoration of order.
So what he thinks about what
did he suggest?
Any concrete steps? Yeah. He doesn't suggest steps, so this would be not conservative. maybe I think he suggests in some ways that the religion is the most important, and to envision an order of things which are not like most of modern people think about the universe. That, for example, the universe has no cause, or the universe cause is just chaos, or evolutionism. So he was not evolutionist. I think he disputed Darwinism. So there's no automatical evolution, but there's a spiritual principle. So we can say it's God, or a godlike being. So it's a first being, or just like a scholastic theology or philosophy, or Aristotelianism, the one. And if people think about the world in such terms, the things will be restored. So organically.
This is an interesting point that you mentioned, that he was against Darwinism.
Yeah.
So then his anti-Nazism stance even makes more sense, because Nazism was an extreme Darwinistic ideology, to an extent, survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
How the British Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Serbia, as far as you know,
Kuehnelt-Leddihn had an influence on some concrete political movement, and could you make some interconnection parallel or whatever with, for instance, Strauss and Neo Conservatives? One question or two questions.
Could you repeat?
He heard Kuehnelt-Leddihn had influence on some concrete political movement.
I think maybe the American libertarianism. So today's libertarian thinkers, such as Hermann Oppe, if you know him, he refers Kuehnelt-Leddihn sometimes, but I don't know if it is a real political movement or just
Stream. Intellectual stream.
intellectual. It's like an intellectual. This is maybe, and there are kind of very little monarchist movements, and in their ideology can be you can see these thoughts or this kind of intellectual ground like Kuehnelt-Leddihn. But these are not considerable movements in today's politics.
What Andrei asked about his possible connections with, I don't know, Leo Strauss at that time, because you mentioned with Buckley, with Russell Kirk and so on, but actually with Strauss and this line which produced neo-conservatives in some way. Because, for example, he had very radical stances on Vietnam War. He was against, finishing, he wanted the power until the end against the communism, so that might be interesting.
It's very interesting because I don't know about if they were connected or not, but it is very possible that they were connected because Strauss has similar lines, very similar lines. So I don't know why, if it's so. If there are connections or not, maybe there was connections.
If there aren't any more questions, I would like the audience to grant another round of applause to our guests.